This afternoon, we have one panel, and then it's going to be followed by a roundtable presentation and the keynote address. On this panel, we have three speakers. The overarching topic for the panel is the political economy of division and reconciliation, an important element of the puzzle. And for our first speaker, we have Hans Kundnani, who is at the German Marshall Fund. And his paper title is Economic Interdependence and Collective Memory in International Relations, Lessons from Germany for Asia, ? So.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you very much as well to Bev for the invitation to be here. It's a really interesting, yeah, it is on. Can people hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've already learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to learning more during the second half of the day. I'm a Germany expert, and I'm going to talk about the lessons from Germany for Asia, something that's already come up. This question of what the European experience tells us about contemporary Asia, But I'm going to look not so much at division as reconciliation between Germany and its neighbours, in particular France, and then also to look at the case of China and Japan. So in other words, external reconciliation. And I'm going to say something about international relations theory, in particular liberal and realist international relations theory, and what they tell us about the two cases, Germany and France, and Japan and China. Ultimately, what I'm going to try to explore is the question of causality of reconciliation, I guess, which seems to me run through some of the discussions this morning. What drives reconciliation? I thought, for example, that Lily's point about Adenauer's courage, I mean, very interesting. What role do individuals play? Is that actually what drives reconciliation? Or on the other hand, to what extent is it structural factors that create the conditions for statesmen like Adenauer to show personal courage? And in particular, what I'm going to look at is the factor of economic interdependence and the role that plays in reconciliation between these two different sets of states. And to try to answer the question of, or at least make some observations about why, as Lily said, Germany and Japan, these two countries that in some ways were quite similar after World War II as pariah states, had such different trajectories. I'm afraid that my conclusion is going to be rather pessimistic. Bev started by talking about Germany as a poster child for reconciliation, but then it seems to me that during the course of the discussion there's been several people, Stefan and then Bev herself, who've qualified that and suggested that there are limits to the extent to which the German experience is applicable to Asia. I'm going to agree with that. I'm going to share that pessimism and perhaps even go further and suggest that, as Xiaosheng Tang just said in the previous discussion, that perhaps actually, at least insofar as external reconciliation goes, the lessons from German history are from a slightly different period, or at least potentially from a slightly different period of German history than the post-war period. Let me start by just making an observation about memory, which ties in with some points that were made this morning, particularly by John Lee, about the relationship in a way between the past and the present, and the concept of collective memory, because. It seems to me that often in discussions of the role of collective memory in international relations, the focus is on the way that the past shapes the present. And so it's about the impact of the past on the present. But the concept of collective memory that goes back to Maurice Halbwachs is very much a two-way process between the past and the present. It's as he put it, a reconstruction of the past in the light of the present. And so the form and the content of memory, it seems to me, is determined by present concerns rather than simply being determined by the nature of the past. Collective memory is by definition selective memory, and it can be manipulated on the basis of the needs of the present. In this sort of presentist view of memory, the past is usable. And in the context of international relations, what that seems to me to suggest is that it's not just that the foreign policy of states is shaped by memory, but that they themselves instrumentalize memory in order to pursue certain interests, which actually derive from whether they're economic interests or strategic interests. And so really what I want to focus on is that side of the two-way process between the past and the present, as it were, the way in which memory is used, the way in which the past is used. And in particular, what is memory used for? Is it used for policies that actually tend towards reconciliation or actually undermine reconciliation and ultimately potentially lead to war? It seems to me that's a very complex question, and it can work in different ways. Liberal and realist international relations theorists, it seems to me, diverge on this point, because if both assume this model of memory whereby states use the past, instrumentalize the past, I guess that realists would assume that that states instrumentalize memory for strategic purposes, for security above all, whereas I guess liberals would assume that states instrumentalize memory for other purposes like welfare maximization. So let me start with the case of post-war Europe, and in particular the relationship between Germany and France, which is, I guess, impossible to separate from the broader context of European integration. And there, in this case, there does seem to be a symbiotic relationship between economic interdependence and reconciliation. But in a sense, it goes to the heart of the European Union, how to understand the European Union, because it's not entirely clear, it seems to me, whether what's going on in the history of European integration, and particularly in terms of relations between France and Germany, is that a desire for reconciliation drove economic interdependence, or whether actually what's happening is the other way around, that economic interdependence, in a sense, creates the conditions for reconciliation. The Schuman Declaration famously suggested that the intention was to make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. And that suggests that actually it is the desire for reconciliation that is driving economic interdependence. But other historians and theorists of European integration, I'm thinking particularly of Alan Millward and Tony Judd, see the relationship the other way round and suggest that, for example, as Tony Judd puts it, actually what was driving European integration in the 50s and 60s were what he calls realistic national motives of the most conventional and traditional kind. And that, as he put it, an ontological ethic of political community was retrospectively invoked in order to supplement the more banal logic of economic advantage. Whichever of those two accounts is correct, it seems to me that the European case, the French-German case, does confirm liberal ideas about the relationship between economic interdependence and international politics. There's a kind of symbiotic relationship going on. And so economic interdependence in the European case seems to have been a positive force, one that reinforces a kind of a national interest formulation that tends towards cooperation rather than towards conflict. In particular, the gains from trade lead states to define their interests in terms of peace rather than war, and to instrumentalize memory in pursuit of that. In parenthesis, I think as a couple of people, Eric and Lily, have pointed out already, this success story, the story of the sort of symbiosis between economic interdependence and reconciliation does need a little bit of an epilogue since the Euro crisis began. When you look at the resurgence of collective memory in Europe, particularly between Greece and Germany, but not exclusively, and so it does seem as if memory conflicts are once again sharpening in Europe, not just despite economic interdependence, but actually you could argue precisely because of a particular step in economic interdependence, in other words, the creation of the single currency. And so in a way, this is actually a crisis of interdependence, it seems to me, the Euro crisis. Nevertheless, there is clearly no danger of war in Europe, and in that sense, I think the story, the success story, still works. Asia, it seems to me, in some ways is quite similar in terms of the story of increasing economic interdependence between China and Japan as part of a bigger picture of increasing economic interdependence. It didn't begin as early as in Europe, and it clearly hasn't gone as far. But nevertheless, there has been this increase in economic interdependence. However, it doesn't seem to have led to reconciliation in the same way. In fact, memory conflicts seem to be becoming more rather than less salient in Asia, despite the developments of the last couple of weeks that we've been hearing about. And this symbiosis that existed in Europe doesn't seem to exist in Asia. For me, the question is then why that is, The Asian example seems to me to challenge the assumptions of liberal theory about the relationship between economic interdependence and reconciliation. And at a first glance, at least, realism seems more helpful in understanding this relationship in Asia. According to realist theory, economic interdependence can actually increase the chances of war rather than reducing it, as liberals tend to assume. And in particular, I've been very struck recently by the work of Dale Copeland, who has developed something called trade expectations theory, where it's not so much the levels of economic interdependence that determine whether war happens or not, but the expectations about the future of that economic interdependence. At the same time, though, it seems to me that the example of China and Japan, although it challenges these liberal assumptions about economic interdependence and war, in some ways it may confirm liberal assumptions about the way that the role that memory plays in national interest formation. In particular, democratic peace theory or capitalist peace theory is potentially quite interesting here in terms of arguing that the internal character of states matters in terms of determining whether states seek cooperation or conflict. In particular, a liberal might explain the memory conflicts in Asia by reference to the Chinese Communist Party's need to strengthen its legitimacy after 1979. And as Stefan Haggard just pointed out, this kind of victim narrative that has become apparently even stronger since Tiananmen Square. I mean, you said 1990, but certainly around that period fits in with this argument, I think. The problem, I think, with this argument, though, is that although it might be helpful in explaining what's going on between China and Japan, it doesn't really explain the bigger picture, in particular the ongoing memory conflicts between Japan and South Korea, which are obviously both democracies. And this is where, again, I think the insights of realism become helpful in terms of understanding international politics in Asia. In particular, realist theory, structural realist theory in particular, starts from the nature of the international system, and which in turn depends, and the relationships of states, which depend to some extent on geography. And I think in particular, realist insights into rising powers and aspiring hegemons are helpful here especially. I'm thinking obviously here in Asia about China and the way that China, uniquely, it seems to me, has territorial claims that go way beyond what is justified by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And therefore needs, it seems to me, to invoke historical arguments and to mobilize memory in a way that other states in Asia don't. As I say, not so much because it's an authoritarian state, but because it's an aspiring hegemon. It has a particular geopolitical need to instrumentalize memory. And I think this also illustrates that memory can be instrumentalized for realist as well as liberal foreign policy objectives. If that's all correct, then I think it does raise the question that you brought up in the last session, which is that although it's very, very tempting to think about post-war European history, European integration as a potential model for Asia, it may be that actually the great power competition that led to World War I is actually a more useful example. After all, that was also a period leading up to World War I in which there was economic interdependence too. Aaron Freeberg wrote a famous essay in 2000 called Will Europe's Past Be Asia's Future?, in which he argued that great power rivalry in Asia in the 21st century would resemble that in Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And in particular, there's this parallel between China now and Germany then. What Edward Luttwak has called the inevitable analogy between these two rising powers that are seeking to challenge the predominant maritime power of the day, the UK at that time and the US then. To conclude, it seems to me that actually looking at potential parallels between China now and Germany then, although it leads us to a much more pessimistic place, actually is potentially quite illuminating. This starts, I think, with some of these structural similarities between Germany then and China now as kind of land powers that are seeking to become sea powers, aspiring hegemons, and so on. But I think an equally interesting but perhaps less well explored comparison between Germany then and China now is sort of an ideological one, as it were, the discourse in the two countries. In particular, nationalism in China now and in Germany at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 21st century. It even strikes me that memory could be playing a somewhat similar role in China now as it did in Wilhelmine Germany. In particular, this proliferation of sites of memory in China since 1979 does, to me, recall what Herfried Münkler, the German historian, has called the Verdenkmalung, or memorialization, that took place in Germany after unification in 1871. And so it seems to me that as well as examining the nature of memory culture and national interest formation in the Federal Republic as a way to illuminate contemporary Asia, perhaps we should also be looking at memory culture and national interest formation in the Kaiserreich.
Do you have a pointer? Okay.
Sorry, I'm just doing my due diligence. The next paper is by Yung-hsiang Ying from the National Taiwan Normal University, The Entangled Issues of Social Justices and Globalization, a Case of Integrated or Divided Taiwan. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation from the Institute of East Asian Studies. I find myself sitting in the room with a bunch of the people from international political science and scientists, and also international relations. And I found it very interesting from the morning to now. And it's a very different experience from my previous experience. So in this morning, lots of people talk about divided nations in different areas and different countries. And I'd like to present my paper in the early divisions in Taiwan and also the new type of divisions of Taiwan. And this is Taiwan Strait. It is now white on the map, 150 kilometer, between 150 to 200 kilometers. But it's wide enough to separate the countries, Taiwan and China, in terms of political point of view and also economic point of view and the cultural point of view. And I think this histories a lot of people in this room understand quite well, but allow me to take 1 minute to emphasize one more time. Actually, from the 1684, the last dynasty of China, Qing dynasty, declared the sovereignties of Taiwan, and it ruled Taiwan for 211 years. And as you know, in 1895, Taiwan was ceded to Japanese Empire, and they ruled the Taiwan for 50 years. And 16 years later, 1911, and the Qing dynasty ended by the Republic of China. And another 34 years, and Taiwan returned back to Republic of China. So the changing political regimes and political capital keeping changing to Taiwanese. It's like a political circles tool, and the tools, the center of the tool is keeping changing. And I like to remind you, in 1987, that is the time when the martial laws ends. So KMT kept the regime from 87 to year 2000, and then DPP took a regime for 8 years, then back to KMT. So in the early divisions, if we talk about the cultural, economic, and political impacts, suddenly there are almost 1 million mainlanders structurally immigrate to Taiwan in 1949. And suddenly this Taiwan, the islands increased by 16.7% populations increase within the 2 years. And this is the picture I downloaded from the web. And actually, this is the village designed for the mainlanders moved to Taiwan in 1949. And that's the place they live. And I downloaded this picture because I know Vincent was from this area. This is down to the Kaohsiung. And I also have a few years experience living in this village. And from the cultural separation and the divisions, I take myself as an example. My last name is Ying, Y-I-N-G. To my memories, this is kind of like a mark to myself, because there are 40,000 faculty, professors teaching in the higher education in Taiwan, 156 universities and colleges. I'm the only one carrying this last name. So when I was a childhood, and people ask me, your dad and your grandpa must from China. So this is kind of my memory. So, and this memory gradually fade away because people won't ask this question that often. But if we take a look at the economic point of view, income gap between Taiwan and China. So I took this data from Maddison's studies. And if you take a look at it from 1870 to 1949, actually the real income per capita in China doesn't change that much. But from Taiwan, from 1870 to 1890, and you can see since 1890, the income gradually increased and increased to almost $1,600 in 1942. That was 3 times higher than the income in China. So you can imagine when this 1 million mainlanders moved to Taiwan in 1949, that's a huge impact economically to Taiwanese. Politically, KMT applied clientelism, that's a 2-dimensional mechanisms, and keep the high rankings officials and positions, ministers to the mainlanders, and the relatively low rankings officials position for the Taiwanese. The reason they can do that because they receive lots of infrastructures and a huge investment left by Japanese. So we call the party state. And the reason why KMT can keep this early division for half centuries, because they have a quite well performance in economic development. So in the very beginning, from 50 to 64, the import substitutions and the export-led growth policy, you can see from 1950 to year 2000, they kept to 6.21% growth relative to the others political regimes' performance. The new type of division, I think that's something the people in economics and the political economy feels they pay a lot of attention recently. First of all, Taiwan is highly dependent on international trade. If we add the export plus the import divided by the GDP, we call trade dependence ratio. So Taiwan is 110%. And we are the 16th largest trading nations in year 2014. If we take a look at our trading, most important trading partners in the world, there are only two countries, US and also Germany. They are not in Asia circle. But since we're highly dependent on international trade, and we can take a look at the year from 1960 up to today, you can see there are very two high growth in 1975 to 1980. And the second high growth was 1981 to 1984. And since then, the cycle became very mild. We call the Great Moderation period. But after 1987, the cycle became quite volatile. The blue line, let me remind you, the blue line is the growth rate of the US. So you can see that Taiwanese growth rate is much volatile than the US. So since 1987, the martial law ends. And if we pay the attention on these two lines, the maroon color and the green color. The maroon colors is the real wage rate for manufacturing sector. And the green line is the service sector. And you can see after 1987, the real wage growth substantially decreased. And the speed we decrease even faster than the economic growth decrease. So this is the warning to the KMT and also to all the political regimes in Taiwan. But people complain why we have this decreasing real wage. Without complaining to the government, if we use what we call Solow residuals and we collect the data and show it to you, on your left-hand side is GDP. On your right-hand side is the physical capital. And L is the labor hours. The AT is what we call total factor productivity. I'd like to show it to you. The reason why we have constant decreasing real wage rate, because the every hours we work now, we bring the less value-added product to the country and also to the world. You can see after 1987, the total factor productivity keep decreasing fastly. So without changing the total factor productivity, it's very hard to bring up the real wage rate. And the people ask, and why total factor productivity decreases? So after 1987, when the martial law ends, within the 2 years, there are 23,000 small, medium enterprises moved to China. So create a huge structural unemployment in Taiwan. And if we check the data, how much we invest in China, in 1991, we invest $10 out of from $100 in China every year. And last year, we invest $87 out of from $100 every year in China. So lower cost is the main driven incentive for the Taiwanese SME move to China. But at the same time, we lost the opportunity to upgrade our competitiveness in the industries. So this is based on Chang and Kuo in Academic Syndicate paper. And at the same time, when we participate in international trade and the regional trade, I also like to show it to you, the worsening income inequality in Taiwan. So if you take a look at the 1%, top 1% household holding the GDP in Taiwan, from 87 to today, they grew 71%. This is also same for the top 5% richest families household in Taiwan. For top 10%, they grew about 33%. So that's a national level. If we bring down the data into the prefectures around the nation, you can see on the top left side, in 1982, the richest area is Taipei, and also we call the new Taipei city now, and also Hsinchu area. And the blue color, that means the 10% above the national level and keep increasing by the colors, the blue color. The maroon color, that means represent the 10% below the national level and decreasing, increasing the severity by the color of maroon and also the blue. And you can see in 1990s, and it doesn't change that much, but we have a pool of prefectures increased in the southern area and also southeast area. And this situation does not alleviate and also become the mild. You can see even worse in the year 2006. And in year 2014, we even have some like a buffer zone in the middle. The richest area get richer, the poor area get poor. So if we ask what party represent the rich and the powerful, the group, and more than 60%, between 60 to 50% of people respond, the KMT represent the rich and the powerful group, and only about 20% and answer DPP represent the rich. And you can guess and imagine this poor area is supported by the DPP voters and also left-wing parties. And this is very clear to the Hibbs traditional partisan theories. In the southern area, we call penguin area. And this is DPP, the heavy voters and the supporting area in the south. In the north area is a pen blue, so this is the area supported the KMT. So this income inequality and also the class, the difference, finally outbreak in year 2010. And Hsinchu Scientific Park, Technological Park, produced about 10% of national GDP. It's a very important the scientific part to Taiwan. But in year 2010, there are 4 families. Their lands was not legally legally received by the government. So 4 families, they against the extension of a Hsinchu scientific and the technological park, and resulted to the very big scale of demonstrations. This is seriously damaged the Ma Ying-jeou's administration's poor rate. And in the last, I'd like to mention the globalization and the regional business cycle to Taiwan. And we know the RTA, Regional Free Trade Agreements, is approaching. And the one circle is TPP on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is RCEP. And they will become the one of the largest trading blocks in the world. TPP will account 38% international trade volume, and RCEP will account 30% of the trade volume in the world. And Taiwan is not invited both. When we talk about the regional free trade agreement, lots of Taiwanese seems to cast this feeling to the trade with China. This is an incident outbreak last year in year 2014. And Professor Hager mentioned the sunflower movement happened last year. I remember before this movement, I was quite popular in classroom to teach economics. But suddenly students questioned me, do you still support the welfare of international trade? And lots of students left the classroom and participate in this movement. And I'm glad. It only lasts about 1.5 months. Then I gradually get my popularity back in the classroom. So if we take a look at the future RCEP to Taiwan, and I download the data, and I like to remind you to take a look at this the circle in the lower button. This lower button is the data for 1980 to year 2014. When you take a look at the data, Taiwan was quite close, the business cycle movement with the member in the RCEP, RCEP. But if we take a look at, on the right-hand side, the circle, that is the newer data from 1996 to year 2014. What did you see from these two circles is gradually we are not highly integrated with these members of RCEP than before. But if we take a look at the other countries, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, Korea, and Japan, correlated with the future members of RCEP, they are more and more integrated together. And why I emphasize the integrations of the business cycle, when we have a more synchronized the business cycle, we will have better usage of TFP, total factor productivity. That means we can learn from each other. But if you are decoupling your business cycle with the others, and you become more divergent of a business cycle, then your TFP, total factor productivity, will become even lower. So this is like the vicious cycle. When you have the lower total factor productivity, that means you will have a lower wage. And this is the paper I published 2 years ago, and the journal is hosted by the econ department in UC Berkeley. That is the model we use in the paper. On the left-hand side, the first equation is the business cycles. On the right-hand side, the first independent variable is party difference. So we measure the party difference, the political ideology difference. And we find political ideological difference is a major negative influence to the business cycles, to the economy. So if we have a two political party, DPP, and also the KMT struggle in debating the international trade policy, and I assume, I haven't had this data and the model around, but I assume this will not good to the total factor productivity, and it is long run damage the real wage rate in Taiwan. So I like to draw my conclusions quite easily. The Dot Mitra year 2005 paper that emphasized left and versus right-wing party in international trade policy. And we know DPP, relative to the KMT, is more conservative in international trade policy. So will DPP and the KMT continue to struggle to lead the position in approaching RTAs? I think that is the major and also the proper solution to our the low real wage rates in the future. So I already mentioned the connection between worsening TFP and also income equality. And the last paper I like to mention is Freeman and Quinn. 2 years ago, they published the income equality will hurt the democracy in the long run. And the last conclusion I like to make is we heard a lot of presentation from political scientists about the sovereignties and also divisions from your analysis. And I like to remind myself and also the audience here, but in Taiwan, if we cannot find the proper solution to mild or to solve the income inequality, the progress of political dialogue, I think, will be limited. So either status quo or separation, I think the process will be prolonged. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And the last paper on this panel is Birgit Geipel, and she's from a PhD student at UC Riverside. Her paper is called North Korea's Unification Without the South, Ideological Survival Strategies in the Post-Socialist Era.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to have the opportunity to present at this conference. So far, it's been really a wonderful experience to be in one room with so many specialists. Okay, I'd like to start with this photo. It's the Berlin Wall, symbol of the vision of Germany, but it has been turned into a work of art, the East Side Gallery. So now it is a symbol of unification. And if you look closely, you can see that there is a Korean writing on the wall. It says, "우리의 소원은 통일," our wish is unification. So you can see in one frame the symbol of German division, the symbol of German unification, but also inscribed into it a wish for future Korean unification. So in my paper today, I'd like to discuss the unique case of Germany and Korea as ideologically divided nations, and I'd like to analyze the effectiveness of nationalism in unification discourse. I will focus especially on North Korea's cooptation of the unification discourse to further strengthen the ideological unity of their own state. To support, I will look at 2 North Korean literature and film texts also. So, if you're talking about national division, the concept of the nation is a key point, it's a key issue of national division and unification. It is essential to understand why and how national sentiment differs in two national contexts. The nation, defined by Benedict Anderson as an imagined political community, was constructed under different historic circumstances in Germany and Korea. So Germany's national identity is generally acknowledged as complicated. Its development went from Fichte's concept of Kulturnation over the formation of a nation-state in 1871 to the imperialist ethnic nationalism of the Nazi era, and then finally resulted in a rejection of nationalism in the post-war era until its artificial resuscitation for unification purposes. In Korea, the case is different. Also, the subjects of Joseon dynasty had no concept of national belonging. A strong ethnic nationalism developed in resistance to Japanese colonial oppression. And here also, as we've heard before, historian Hsinchu helped to construct it by introducing the concept of the homogeneous ethnic nation, the Minchok, in 1908. So Minchok is a neologism joining the Chinese characters for Min, for people, and for Chok, which is mostly used in words in the field of clan, tribe, and familia, as Andrew Smith points out. So the amalgamation of 2 characters with different connotations has evolved into one powerful concept, which remains uncontested in the popular discourse until today, both in North and in South Korea, as we have heard before. So what effects do those different concepts of nations have towards the attitudes towards unification? So in West and East Germany, we've heard before, in West Germany, there was the concept of one nation and 2 states. But in the GDR, there was the concept of 2 nations. So the GDR wanted a separate GDR identity based on anti-fascism. So the GDR did not have a concept of unification. It constructed its identity solely around the anti-fascism and ignoring the ordinary people's wish for unification. So with the growing economic discrepancy between the 2 states, citizens in the East started to identify more and more with the West German concept of one nation, 2 states. And also the West Germany offered a package of economic prosperity, the possibility of national identification, and the hope for unification. In the contrast to East Germany's economic regression, a post-national concept of an anti-fascist nation, and the insistence of the partition of East and West. So what happened is West Germany capitalized on, which is quote-unquote, the failure of East Germany to provide a real German national identity, what the ordinary people longed for. So this idea of an ethnic nation was revived in West Germany only for the purpose of reunification. But after this initial euphoria of unification, reality set in, and people in East Germany were quite disillusioned. And ironically, after unification, actually, a GDR identity was constructed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, because East German citizens felt marginalized in the way that they were singled out by their own consumption patterns, by their different ways of clothing and so on. So it is only after unification that a kind of East Germany identity evolved. And that East German identity is very much connected to consumption patterns and to economics. So in South Korea, we have a different case. We have the case that both nations claim to be one nation, and that they each other, for a long time, claimed that the other one was the traitor to the nation. So both countries have a strong longing for unification. And after the German unification, Ostpolitik and unification through absorption in Germany was evaluated positively by South Korea. And also in the Sunshine Policy, there was a hope that the situation could be emulated. So it was the idea that, that also in South Korea one could count on the bond through nationalism. And of course, the era of the Sunshine Policy had positive effects towards like easing the tension between the two states. But it was also connected to the hope that the situation in Germany could be reproduced. So during the Sunshine Policy, North Korea for the first time was recognized a legitimate state, and much hope was put into the two inter-Korean summits in 2001 and 2007, so that the ice between the two states could be thawed. This also came along with the hope that North Korea might eventually yield to the South, as East Germany yielded to the West. But when we specifically contrast East Germany and North Korea, they are similar in their self-definition through anti-fascism. However, in the East German case, anti-fascism excludes a German national identity as the identity of the perpetrator, while in North Korea, anti-fascism is coupled with anti-colonialism, strengthening Korean national identity. While West Germany utilized nationalism to fill the void of national identity in East Germany, South Korean rapprochement is counteracted by Northern unification ideology that is rooted deeply in anti-US neo-imperialism. Thus, unlike East Germany, North Korea is ideologically well prepared against South Korean rhetoric. I said, unlike East Germany, North Korea is better prepared, ideologically prepared against the South Korean rhetoric. Okay, so North Korean communism has been nationalistic from the very beginning. And as Charles Armstrong points out, in the case of North Korea, we can speak about a Koreanization of Soviet communism. Since 1967, the concept of juche, of self-reliance, has been key to North Korea. And we also experience a growing nationalism in North Korea since the 1990s. So why since the 1990s? This is the Songun era, the military first era. So what is the political situation? We have an economic and moral crisis through the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc and through natural disasters, and also through the passing away of the leader Kim Il-sung. And this also enforced economic opening on North Korea, and as we've heard before, in the last decades there has been much more influence, foreign influence in North Korea than there has before. So not only economic, but also cultural influence. So North Korea reacted towards this with enforced nationalism. So for example, also in December 1990, as Hsinchu points out, Kim Jong-il made an explicit reference to the failure of East Europe in contrast to North Korea, held up by the ideal of juche. So what is happening is that it's actually the economy is suffering, but the ideology is not suffering, because the ideology of self-reliance kind of points out that North Korea is still supreme for the reason that it survived the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. So what I would like to look at are the works of art, and they're producing counter-narratives of reverse cultural influence against the reality of a global post-socialism. So while North Korea at that time experiences a lot of foreign cultural influx, the narratives it produces are suggesting the opposite. So I will now analyze a novel and a film which are both characteristic examples of this period. Both engage with the possible dangers of the situation of a global post-socialism, but provide a powerful antidote. They reverse the flow of cultural influence from the reality of growing foreign influence in North Korea to the spreading true Korean culture to the rest of the Korean nation and outside North Korean state territory. So the first novel I'm looking at is Kim Nam-ho's Manam Meeting, which was published in 2001. And this is an illustration from the book itself. So Manam was published to commemorate the Inter-Korean Summit in 2000. The setting of the novel is South Korea, which is interesting for the period because now the setting is more often South Korea, or South Korean characters are more often incorporated into the stories. The protagonists are South Korean journalists Tae Myung and Hyuna, and the whole story is a parable of unification. So the fate of the nation is parallel to the fate of the couple in the story, and the protagonist, Tae Myung, he is a South Korean journalist, and he used to be a pro-communist leader of the student movement in the 1980s. But then he got imprisoned, he got morally broken, and then he witnessed the downfall of the communist world, and because of that, he is so disillusioned that he decides to live a comfortable life in South Korea and become a pro-government journalist, until he's finally recovering his true face and comes back to the North Korean cause. And because he loses faith, his fiancée, Hyuna, she decides to break up with him because she cannot live with someone who does not have faith in the North Korean mission anymore. So, but in the end, they're reconciled through Tae Myung experiencing Kim Jong-il speaking at the Inter-Korean Summit, and this is when the couple reconciles. And this is also when unification seems about to happen. So what the novel is using is actually the situation, the real situation of the disillusionment of a lot of participants in the student movement in the 1980s. And it portrays also how Tae Myung turns to a postmodern mindset. And his fiancée, Hyuna, she's constantly working against that, and she's constantly enforcing the concept of the minjok and trying to remind him what their real cause is. But in the end, it's only through seeing Kim Jong-il that he can be reconverted to the true path. And the story ends with the couple getting back together again, and the story also ends with a prospect of unification that's going to come soon. So it's really insinuated that unification is going to happen any second. So in Manam, really the concept of minjok is the key concept. And it becomes the answer to any question, any uncertainty and anxiety caused by the events of global political change and the dissolution of the Cold War order. The downfall of the rest of the communist world, however much it affected the real living conditions in North Korea, does not constitute a threat to North Korean ideology, as in fact it merely reinforces the concept of supremacy of North Korean nationalist communism standing strong and independent through the Juche ideology. Minjok, always seen as the connecting force, is only recognized as true in combination with true faith in Juche. So South Koreans who do not believe in the importance of independence are seen as traitors to their people, as we can see in the relationship between Hyuna and Tae Myung, because as soon as Tae Myung loses faith, he's not considered a partner anymore, he's not considered somebody you could love. So the bond of family and love does not count if the person lacks the right ideological commitment. So kinship employed as the ultimate answer to the unification question becomes meaningless when it is not combined with the right ideological mindset. So therefore, Monam unwittingly exposes the concept of a North-South union through the connective force of Minchok, as it is used in the novel as purely theoretical and only supporting an illusion of unification. So in North Korea, identity is stabilized in the euphoria in the moment of unification through a continuous evocation of imminent unification. So actually, in North Korea, unification is happening any minute ever since the 1990s. The euphoria will not subside as it did after the unification in Germany, as it is frozen in a moment of pre-unification. So eventually, the unification discourse in North Korea is not aimed at unification with South Korea, but propagated through to stabilize the inner ideological unity of North Korea in times of crisis. Okay, the film I would like to look at is called 우리의 향기, Our Fragrance, and it's from 2003. And again, here we have a love story. So it's a story of matchmaking with hindrances between Sepyeol and Pyeongho, but it's also a lecture on the correct spirit of the Minchok. So we have two families contrasted to each other. One is the traditional family and one is the westernized family. So the traditional family is that of Pyeongho, who is a kimchi researcher, so doing work in favor of the nation. And the westernized family is the family of Sepyeol, who is a tour guide for foreigners. And because she's working with foreigners and also because her family is doing a lot of work related to foreigners, we can see a lot of harmful Western influences. And this is especially depicted in the film by the visuality because the scenes change between his home and her home. And we can see that she lives in a very tasteless, westernized, decadent environment, as we can see here in the picture. She's holding the blonde doll and admiring this blonde doll. So we can see she's really westernized. She lost her way. While the scenes in Pyeongho's house, we can see this is very traditional. The grandfather engages in traditional activities like calligraphy. We have a lot of traditional paintings. But then we also have the modern appliances, such as a fan or a telephone. So we can see a traditional home with all the modern convenience. So those two homes are contrasted. And the story goes on because both of them, Pyeongho and Sepyeol, they are both elected to participate in a fashion contest because they look so purely Korean. So through this, they keep interacting. And the story keeps going. And, but because Sepyeol is so westernized, they cannot get together until we have the final scene when Sepyeol witnesses how Pyeongho explains kimchi to the foreign tourists, and he acts as a cultural ambassador. And the foreign tourists actually react very positively to what he says about kimchi. And so we can see the Korean influence to the rest of the world. And Sepyeol witnesses this, and this is when she changes her mind and she finds her true way again. And we can see in the last scene, she's truly reconverted to be a traditional Korean wife. Thank you. So, Our Fragrance is another trope of national unification. So it's only when Sepyeol is Koreanized again, re-Koreanized, she becomes an acceptable bride for Pyeongho. Here again, Pyeongho's affection for Sepyeol is completely dependent on her recognizing the importance of the concept of Minchok. So in addition, it is noteworthy that the film shows an abundance of luxury in a time of scarcity. And as we know, consumption has always been strongly politicized in socialist societies. So the East German authority was undermined by the influx of Western consumer goods and the GDR's inability to compete with their own products. The North Korean solution, at least on a discursive level, is to put the cultural value of their own national luxury goods against foreign import. Consumer goods from outside the DPRK are demonized as Western and not fit for the national spirit. And South Korean products are non-national and non-existent, as South Korean identity is negated under US neo-imperialism. So consuming the wrong Western products following the film's logic will result in a loss of national identity. In other words, the longing for luxury goods is pacified by the imaginary of national superiority. So the DPRK did not melt under South Korean sunshine policy in the way the GDR succumbed to Ostpolitik, despite the hopes that arose from the first Inter-Korean summit. However, there's a change since the 1990s in North Korean attitudes towards the South, as seen in literary and cinematic representations. South Koreans and the ethnic community of Koreans in other countries make their appearances in a much larger context, and yet I argue this is just to support this concept of Minchok and the homogeneous ethnic nation. So consequently, North Korea's unification discourse, which is based on the convictions that the Minchok cannot remain divided, is not aimed at the real unification with South Korea, and the discourse itself is rather directed towards stabilizing the own inner unity in resistance to Southern or other foreign influences. Therefore, paradoxically, North Korea survives in a constant claim to aim for unification, while East Germany perished in its efforts to stabilize its state, insisting on the wish of continued independence from the fascist West German nation. Thank you.
For those of you who are watching the clock, there's been a slight change in the way that we're rolling out the afternoon. So right now, Chang, professor of government from the College of William and Mary, who is listed as a discussant but was also on the roundtable discussion with practitioners and academics, will give his remarks. And in the interest of providing more time for an open discussion, what the organizers have decided to do is to, since most of the people who were on the roundtable have spoken and can participate in the open discussion, we're going to skip over the roundtable, expand these remarks, then have the discussion on this session, and then have a more open discussion before we move to the keynote address. So at this point, I'm going to welcome Professor Chang.
Thank you. In my view, these are three excellent papers. They are not just excellent, I believe they fit together very well. Drawing on the IR theories, Hans' paper, I believe, dwelled on the two drivers. For the reconciliations between the two historical rivals in Europe. Two drivers being, of course, economic interdependence and the sort of blurring, if you like, of the collective memories, and sort of tease out the implications of the post-war Franco-German, the affinity for two sort of leading Asian players, China and Japan. And the second paper by Frank papers, I believe, focus on the economic the integration in the region and its impact on the Taiwan's economy and the society, which I believe may have the tremendous implications for the cross-strait relationships. And the third papers by Birgit shows how the DPRK in the versions of the ethnic nationalism, if you like, a sort of kind of puritanical one, or perhaps kind of the Spartan versions of collective memories on the origins and the legitimacies of the authenticity, I should say, of the regime in the North was crafted to sort of lay claim to the cause of unification in appearance, but in actuality to sort of effectively freeze the division between the rich North, rich South, and sort of poor North. So all three papers, as I say, are very excellent and they are very inspiring. So what I will do is just pose a few questions as a point of departure for discussion. All right. The first paper, I believe, Hans hits the nails right on its head, arguing that the baseline model to use to analyze the prospects of the East Asian Sino-Japanese reconciliation is not post-World War II, the continental Western Europe, but rather the 19th century's Western Europe, when Germany was rising hegemonically, much in line with some Yung-hsiang's analysis, if you like. Okay. Unlike what has transpired in the post-war Western Europe, which is the making of the EU's sort of anchors on the historical Franco-Germans of the Entente and dual leaderships, if you like. Okay, The growing economic interdependence in East Asia has actually gone in tandem with the mounting tensions between the Beijing and Tokyo. And the issues of a collective memory has been sort of instrumentalized, to conveniently show up some of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist regime in Beijing, and also to somehow cater to the demands of the ultra-rightists, within the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan and so on, right? So, which is to say that all this makes it impossible, harder, if not impossible, for Beijing and Tokyo to sort of entertain the ideas of the regional sort of cohegemony, if you like. Realism, therefore, to you, it's more sort of the convincing than the sort of liberalism. I think your argumentation is essentially sort of a kind of structural one, structure of this argumentation. The main structural factors being, I believe, the rise of China, which you underscored, and also the second structural factor means the sort of a tension, inherent tension between some land powers and the maritime powers, Beijing and Tokyo, if you like. Therefore, leaving very little room, for the agencies, and political leaderships, if you like, to somehow, co-build something. I think it's very easy to agree with you, and I do agree with you. But just to be a sort of devil's advocate, I'm trying to. May we say that? May we ask if the rekindling of the Sino-Japanese historical animosity has been really structurally predetermined, and has been really kind of inevitable or not? It did not appear to be that way for 3 decades until the last few years. In the 1970s, when the Sino-Japanese détente began, in the 1980s, when China shared the parallel interests with the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, after the post-Tiananmen China decided to resume its opening up, to the world, and Japanese investment and trade with China rebounded. All right. So the meaning that now the trade suspensions, and also at the time, you start seeing sort of transformation of the Chinese and the Sino-Japanese economic interaction there. Trade before that was inter-industry. After that, it was intra-industry, meaning that the sort of trade suspension, if there will be, would mean not just sort of finding alternative sources, alternative suppliers, alternative markets, but also means it would negatively affect the sort of production and employment, and thereby making both sides, theoretically speaking, more hesitant to go for conflicts and more willing to somehow go for the mutual accommodations. It seems to me, all right? So again, and also you see that in the past, the history of textbook issues had also been brushed aside so as not to spoil the economic gain and so on. So I would say that for the 3 decades, it didn't appear to be that, sort of both sides are heading for some sort of tension. So the structural arguments, does it have some limits or not? That's my main questions to you. The gist of the second papers, Frank's paper, another excellent one, on the political economy of Taiwan runs very simply like this. It's Taiwan's insulation from the free trade blocs in the region, and its growing sort of dependence in the investment in China. Led to a declining productivity gains, declining of TFD, total factor of the productivity, and also led to the wages of the stagnations and the widening income disparities between the northern Taiwan and southern Taiwan, and between social classes, if you like, which sits very sort of right squarely, with the political cleavage between the pen blue camps and pen green camps, and so on. And economic divergence, hence, therefore, reinforce the political divides, if you like, making schizophrenic Taiwan even more sort of dysfunctional, unable to dwell on its sort of economic problem things. So that's the gist. And I have sort of 2 quick points for our discussions here. One, I wonder, if there are other drivers as well. If there are these drivers as important as your tools or not. One additional driver, for example, that came to my mind for the wage stagnation, for example, is the sort of SME, Small Enterprise Institute, a small medium enterprise dominated sort of industrial organization in Taiwan, and also weaker labor unions there. Consider South Korean case, for example. with as much sort of the huge amount of the FDI in China as Taiwan's. But its big business and big labor, have been able to somehow get wage to growth, sometimes even at a faster pace than the productivity gain. Another driver that I have in my mind for the increasing sort of income disparity, which has made it difficult. For Taiwan, it's sort of the governments are shrinking the tax base. And also it's growing sort of debt, if you like, which made it very difficult for Taiwan governments to redress the widening the market income gaps on the one hand, and impossible to help the industrial upgrading on the other. So that's question number one. Are there other drivers or not? Second question is sort of so what question. Now that you've got income disparity there, and now it's sort of linked to the sort of investment in China, does it mean that it's bad news for cross-strait relations or not? As we all know from our sort of two of the panels, the economic domain is probably the only bright sort of spot for cross-strait relationship. Political side, political landscape, episodic, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Military security side, very bad. So if this one, is also in danger, then the cross-strait relations seems to be, heading for troubles. Turning to the last paper, which I believe can be summarized as this: the recrafting, recrafting of the official narratives of the DPRK's ethnic nationalism was evidently, in my view, sort of in the paper, a sort of preemptive strike, by North Korea, very timely undertaken, really, in the wake of the 1989 in Eastern Europe, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and also facing the sort of stellar performance of South Korea economic, the rise of South Korea as the middle power. And also in the light of the sort of persistence, the economic stagnation, adversity, if not crisis, that the DPRK has repeatedly fallen into. So in the end of the papers, you ask very, very interesting questions. Why did the sort of the DPRK's draconian versions, if we may use that term, of ethnic nationalism worked? And the other side of this question, of course, is why was the FRG's Ost politics, why was it so consequential and so consequential, whereas the ROK's, the sunshine policy, Nordic politics, Nordic policies was not? Yeah. And you sort of pose this question without answering it, and sort of assuming that if North Korean governments wanted to impose something, it would be that's it. The society will have to accept it, and the sort of the narratives, ideological construction here will work beautifully. We don't need to explain why sort of therefore sunshine policy is not really working at all, in undermining the sort of the North Korean regimes and so on. I just don't know whether it is, we have to accept that at sort of on its face value. Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un could, of course, impose whatever narratives, top down. But would the society believe in what it was told or not? Realizing that, here we have probably realized that a significant portion of the populace and the elites in DPRK probably are aware of the collapse of the Eastern European regimes in 1989, collapse, if you like, under its own dead weight, and also have either heard or seen scenes of the prosperity in South Korea and in China. All right, and also bear in mind that the modern Korea's the socio-political changes has always been shaped by not just great powers in the region, but also by returnees from outside. Syngmanese came back from the United States. Kim Jong-il came back from Moscow. Kim Koo came back from Chongqing, and so on. And there are many returnees to North Korea after 1989. Those guys stationing in Eastern Europe, they have eyewitness, the collapse, the transformational regime there. Why would they be believing in what Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il told them in terms of the sort of ideological construction that they invented and so on? So what I'm saying is that and also bear in mind that perhaps maybe a significant portion of the North Koreans have also been listening to Voice of America, also Radio Free, the Asia, that sort of thing there. And therefore, to conclude, the question is that how enduring and resilient is North Korea's nationalistic ideological construction there? It's being constructed, yes. It appears to be working, but how long-lasting it will be. That's my questions to you. And let me therefore use the last couple of minutes to address address this point that I was going to elaborate during the sort of the round table there. My point, the big point I want to raise there quickly is this. We have so far in this conference laid a lot of emphasis on processes. And Seth Haggard and many others also underscore the importance of endpoints. And the endpoints, end game, should be, we should spell them out. The possibility is there, and we focus on the sort of processes and so on, pathways to the endpoints. Somehow we give sort of a short shrift, to the structural conditions, structural environments, big environments within which all this may take place. And And I think it is necessary to bring these things in. Particularly, we are going to do things that you are doing, Hans, which is diachronic comparison. We are comparing today with sort of 1989, so 35 part there, and so it is important to tease out processes, yes, but it is also important to bring in the structural conditions, if you like. And let me just elaborate just a tiny bit here. It is important to do so because the big environments during the 1980s were obviously quite different from what we are wrestling. We are facing today, or in the last 2 decades something. Those politics began to ferment, if you like, or bear fruit in the 1980s. And recall the take-home points advanced by this guy, which I don't know whether you remember his name. It was Valentin Falin, F-A-L-I-N, a senior former Soviet diplomat, as reported in Timothy Ash's book on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I quote, "Without those politics, without Gorbachev," end quote. But also recall what the Gorbachev said in interviews with, I believe, with the Zeitgeist, that the West had literally arms raised the Soviet Union to death. So during the final decades of the Cold War, one global, if you like, hegemon, the global conditions like one global hegemon, was resurging. Resurging economically and military, while the other global hegemon, Soviet Union, arguably a very limited one, if not a regional one, was indeed sputtering, almost to a halt. So the cash striped the Soviet Union was those winning partner, if you like. Winning economic the partners of the FRG's Austro politics policy, and the Soviet Union did want to make sure that the GDR would not rebel against the policies of Ostpolitics. Now, quickly, let's fast forward now 2 decades. ROK in Korea and ROC in Taiwan have been facing a completely new structural conditions today. What this new and emerging structure out there, international structure out there, is depends on whom you read. To Oxford Trend, for example, Arvind Subramanian, and also London-based Martin Jacques, the power transition from the United States to China, it's not only inevitable, it is actually in the making. Now, if you read other guys, they say Harvard's Neil Ferguson. Well, what we are seeing is not a power transition. It's just right of China to a parity with the United States. So we are seeing the making of a bipolar system there. Now, if you read other guys, the MIT's guy by the name of Barry Posen, well, we are in an age of power diffusion. Power is issue specific, all right? So probably we are heading for, indeed, the multipolar system there. And therefore, structure, has been changing. The question is, what kind of structure is emerging? We don't know. There are three possibilities here. That kind of a structural condition probably will have tremendous implication processes that we're going to see here. It might mean, on the one hand, that maybe, well, with the rise of China, maybe South Korea and Taiwan will have to pay more, to get in one additional units in terms of increase of the reconciliation with the other side. You're going to pay more. On the other hand, you can argue the other way. Maybe, precisely because, you got sort of what the passing of the U.S. Unipolarity, and therefore you have some sort of competitions between the rising power and the extreme power, and therefore these two sort of small nations will have more wiggle rooms, maybe be able to play some sort of balancing game, something. So what I'm saying is that, structure has been changing, and its implication for the process has to be teased out. Thank you.
I think I'd like to give you all a moment, if you'd like, to respond, if you have things that you'd like to respond before I give my comments. Is that okay?
I won't say very much because those are really helpful comments. And I suppose the way I thought about this was that there are so many different variables here that actually it's incredibly difficult to identify the kind of causality and the linkages between them. And even if I were able to do it in the two cases that I'm looking at, it's still only two cases, so it still doesn't get you very far. So I thought about these three different things: economic interdependence, collective memory, and then these structural factors in international relations that you mentioned. And as I say, they're all sort of indeterminate, and in each case they can be drivers or be results of other drivers. I mean, here I thought that Fanya's point as well about sort of top-down memory and bottom-up memory is quite interesting. I think it may be a different way of saying the same thing that I was talking about, because you were talking about state centrism. And I suppose what I was describing was the way that states instrumentalize memory, which I guess would be your top-down memory. But then there's clearly a way in which also there's a bottom-up process where state policy is influenced by memory coming from other places. I think what's quite interesting about that is, and I mean, I assume that, particularly because you talked about the Middle East, you weren't suggesting that the bottom-up memory is always much more positive than the top-down memory. The German-Israeli case does seem to suggest that in a way that it plays quite a positive role in pushing reconciliation. But it seems to me that that there are other cases where it could play actually the opposite role. So I suppose just finally, I mean, I suppose I don't think I wasn't trying to say that. It was very interesting the way you put it in terms of the structural factors didn't leave any room for agency. I hadn't thought about. I hadn't thought that I was saying that. I thought what I was suggesting that there's this very complicated relationship, that perhaps the agency of states is constrained in certain ways. There is still some room, I think, for agency, and this is where, again, I think the point about sort of political leadership is quite interesting. I'm not quite sure to what extent. I mean, how far that goes, I suppose. Clearly, clearly Adenauer did show courage, but I do wonder whether you have to have these conditions in place in order to be able to do that. And then finally, the point about the changes over time is very interesting as well. I mean, I sort of whizzed through this a bit, but it seems to me that it does seem to be the case that under Mao, in particular, that actually at that time memory wasn't instrumentalized in the same way in China. That comes later. That to me suggests I mean, that to me supports the liberal argument that I mentioned in the sense that it suggests that part of what is happening here is that China post 1979 is seeking to create new sources of legitimacy once the ideological source of legitimacy is no longer strong enough. But then again, as I suggested, that doesn't explain everything either, because it wouldn't explain the problems between Korea and Japan. So that's all a very long way of saying it's complicated, I suppose. And I've only scratched the surface, and I'm conscious of that.
Thank you, Professor Chen's comment. I do appreciate that you mentioned these two drivers, and I didn't think of that when I wrote the paper. When you mentioned the Korean also have the huge FDI in China, does that also cause the income disparity? And if we took the counterfactors analysis, assume these small, medium enterprises didn't have the chance to move to China in 1987 and 88. And they face the competition from the regions and from the world. Then they have to be surviving by the destructive creation. But suddenly there's a huge market allow them to extend their outdated technology to produce another 20 years. Then the value added by these companies gradually lost. And also in year 2003, the government, the Taiwanese government opened the investments law for the IT industry to have their factory built in China. And their influx of the FDI went to China for these high industries. At the same time, you lose your own funding, the capital, to continue or to strengthen your R&D in Taiwan. But you use the limited funding to build up the factory to produce in China. So if we took this counterfactors analysis, assumed if there would be no or the limited opportunity for those companies to go there, it might, this income inequality and the structural unemployment situation would not happen that severely in Taiwan. And I also appreciate, Professor Chen, you mentioned the taxpayers' base is gradually loose. And that really gives the limited space for government to ease these income inequality problems. And the second point you address, so if we have $87 out of from hundreds invested in China every year, in last year, for security point of view, it's quite dangerous. If we would have the chance to participate the RCEP or TPP in the next round, or even if we have the better chance to participate sooner, we might have the more opportunity to diversify our investments elsewhere, but not to put all the eggs in the same basket. So it might decrease this security concern for the investments. I do appreciate that you mentioned this main point to give me another point of view to revise my paper. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the summary of. Thank you very much for the summary of my paper and for your wonderful questions. And I would like to address the last question: how long lasting those narratives will be. And actually, with that, you kind of hit the sore spot, because that one I cannot answer. And I think you would need a sociologist or anthropologist to answer that question and to do a lot of field research. And but what I would like to say is that, of course, I'm going with the point that Professor John Lee made earlier. It's not the narratives, it's more the geopolitical actions, it's the economy that finally shapes politics. But in that case, nationalism is a very strong force. And as we've heard earlier in the wonderful presentation about the museum in Korea and the concept of Minjok, nationalism addresses something that's really deeply rooted, our longing for home, our longing for identity, for belonging, for identifying with something. So, and of course, the extent to which a nationalism in North Korea has a almost religious claim. I think in that sense, those narratives are very powerful, because in the end, if there's not a lot to be proud of, or if there's not, if the economy is down, like, one thing you could be proud of is your nation, is your culture, and so it really, those narratives really address these issues. So I think, of course, in the end, those films and those books will not keep up North Korean society, but I think so far they have done the job, and the rest is up to economy.
All right, and I'm going to keep my remarks very short, because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for discussion, and because Professor Chen did such a great job of summarizing what the key points were, and I think this discussion just now was really rich. I'm going to make just a couple of observations very briefly, and that is, so unlike the people on the panel, I am an anthropologist, and I was assigned to discuss this panel, I think, in part because I am interested in division. I'm interested in political economy, and the panel itself, when I read the papers, each of which I enjoyed very much, and I learned a tremendous amount from each of them, I started trying to think, how on earth did this panel get put together as it is? What themes or what commonality can I draw out from this particular set of papers? And I think that's actually one of the real treasures of coming to a meeting like this, because I actually think that it's the friction of having quite different, not just opinions, but different material and different approaches that can actually help people start to think differently about what's going on. And in part, what struck me actually is, Hans's paper is not about national division. It's about reconciliation. It's about conflict or peaceful coexistence. It's not actually about the division of a folk into two nation states, right? And Frank's paper is actually also not exactly about division. It's about an evolving sort of political domain with an incredible diversity of people who have moved from one place to another and who may or may not lay claims at different points in time to the legitimacy as a single place, but a single nation. But that paper is also quite focused, not so much on the division between China and Taiwan, but on the internal division within Taiwan. So it's about internal diversity. And Birgit's paper is about the ways in which sort of affect is constructed over time through political agency and artistic expression and people's daily lives and daily practices in particular ways. And so I think, each of those helps us to understand that, as Hans just said, it is an incredibly complicated topic and domain to try to analyze. I think among the things that link the papers, actually, is that I think all of the papers at some level are not speaking actually about causality or explanation, but they're thinking about potentialities, right? So what potentializes, what makes some outcome possible, and what closes off the potential for other outcomes. So rather than seeking to have explanations for what happened or what will happen, you can look in the material to say what is possible in this particular circumstance and what made those possibilities what we see as available to people in making peace and making reconciliation and making unity and making whatever it is that they're making, right? And so it's a way of reading potentialities in each of these papers might focus on both we are a liberal framework or a realist framework. Both can be read into the same set of materials, but You can disagree with me, actually. So you can take these frameworks to look at the ways that memory is instrumentalized, the way that the structures in which trade or I'm sort of losing my train of thought, actually. The structures in which stability has been achieved at the moment. You can look at that, and then you can say, what potential is there for continued stability? What potential is there for continued peaceful integration? And what potentiates that? And one of the things that actually you don't include in your analysis, which I think actually makes it in some ways less depressing, is the enormous size of China. The fact that China is so incredibly huge in land, in access to the sea, in military power, in the number of people, in its growth potential, I think actually makes it less resonant with the great power comparison of Europe. With the circumstance of particular income inequality and falling wages and all of that in Taiwan, that calls to mind to me so much about so many parts of the world now, so many parts of the world where people have come to assume a particular standard of comfort, a particular standard of comfort within a sort of national community, and what's potentialized as people lose hold of the sense that people share a communal future, a future where equity of some sort will be achieved. So what kinds of stability are potentialized in a situation of growing inequality? And then what I really like about Birgit's paper actually is I never believe that propaganda or art or the things that we say have very direct effects. I think that it's so easy for us to analyze the discourses and the government texts and the posters and everything that we see that are so attractive to analyze, and then say that they have some one-to-one correspondence with how people feel. Of course they don't, right? But I think that what Birgit is showing is that the artists in North Korea, in the context of the North Korean structure of the state oversight of artistic production, have made at hand a particular form of national ideology, which says independence is definitive, is the definitional quality of Korean identity, and that does matter, and the ways that it matters actually have to do with the other unspoken. There are other unspoken issues here, which are, what is the potential for war? What is the potential for revolution? What is the potential for deep disintegration of societies as we watch greater competition among certain states and or integration, as we watch inequalities grow, as we watch diversities become more of what comes to the fore in political discussions around the world, and as we watch more and more political institutional frameworks become dysfunctional because of the competition for authenticity and legitimacy. So I don't have specific questions for any of you, but those were my thoughts as I was trying to sort of come to an understanding of what these three papers have to add to the questions of divided nations and their neighbors. So I don't know if you'd like to respond. You're very welcome to respond, especially since Hans was disagreeing with me. But also, after your response, or if you have nothing else to, if that's just a bleh, then we can open it up to the audience. All right. So I think at this point we do have a few minutes because we're not going to be doing the roundtable. We will have time for a fairly restful break between the time when we have the audience questions and the keynote, but we can open it up for any of you to ask your questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple things. This is very wide-ranging. I wanted first to think back to the title, Divided Nations and Their Neighbors. And the only neighbor we've really been talking about is Japan in the East Asian case, but there are other neighbors there. And I think we also seem to be assuming that China's on this inevitable upward trajectory. But I think in the last couple of years, there's been a great deal of pushback against the Chinese. And we think certainly in the South China Sea, where you've got the Philippines, you've got Vietnam to a certain extent, and then Taiwan coming and going. But the fact that in many ways, if we take a yin-yang perspective, is that as China might be pushing too far and then is stimulating a response against it. You know, you've also got India, you've got Sri Lanka, where you've had pro-Chinese. In Sri Lanka, you had a pro-Chinese government which lost an election. In India, you've got a competition between China and India as well. So I think that, and so when we've got Xi and Ma meeting in Singapore in, I don't know how many hours, is Xi going out of a sense of strength or of insecurity? Is he going because he wants to show how he can engage in this sort of thing? He's so strong he doesn't worry, or is he really worried about internal and external threats, and that's why he's willing to meet with Ma? And then just another thing, TJ mentioned the structural environment. One thing that also keeps coming back to my mind, thinking about China, thinking about North Korea in particular, and I guess the old East Germany, is the whole panopticon element, is where you have, and Havel talks about living in truth. And in these dictatorships, you get what the Chinese call neiwaiyobia. The difference between inner and outer is you learn how to keep your thoughts to yourself and how to biaoxian, how to perform when other people are watching you, because you might be under some sort of a threat if you could be exposed. And one of the big questions, thinking about popular culture in North Korea, there is no popular culture as such. It's all state, what the Chinese call written by committee. The Zhuti Xianqing is the theme is sent down, and then they get a group of people together to come up with a novel or come up with a film or something. Is what are people really thinking? We don't know. And this gets to the top-bottom thing as well. What do people really think? Is it possible that there's some sort of a tipping point or some sort of a black swan that is going to open the door where people will feel comfortable about saying what they really think? I saw this happen in Taiwan in the late 1970s, which opened the door to the rise of the opposition movement. And who knows what people, China's expanded the space for the individual greatly over the course of the reforms. North Korea hasn't yet. But I think that these are all things that we need to take into consideration about the possibility of living in truth, as Havel said.
Thank you. I'll move a little bit to the front. This is already going to be perhaps even a more general comment leading towards our further conversation. What I love about this panel is that although not everyone is a historian, I think most of you are not, we are going back to the essentials of historical thinking of the last century or so, with all the dichotomies out there, or are they truly dichotomies, the structural versus human agency, the realistic and liberal explanations, which again I do not believe are dichotomous. And I would like to reintroduce the moral element, because had we been talking too much about moral elements, I would have said we are not being realistic enough, let's talk economics and so on. But since, especially Hans, I think you kind of led us to it, to what extent is this all exclusively realpolitik? Whether or not it's from the top downwards or from the grassroots up, is it all about self-interest? And again, the case of Germany springs to mind whether or not it can be a good model for East Asia. And it might, because obviously Germany, in the aftermath of the Second World War, had a tremendously self-interested wish to re-enter the club, to become a viable member again. Japan, to some extent, is possibly comparable, but I'm not sure we can treat this here now, since there are no people who can actually represent the Japanese issue from within. But when it comes to Germany, yes, there was self-interest, so to be sure. Adenauer was not just giving away charity, he had none to give. And embarking on the new German-Israeli relationship, and to some degree, obviously, with France, with Poland, was all mentioned here, the Czech Republic, had to do with Germany's wish to re-enter the club of viable members of future international associations from the common market onward to the UN. But was it only about self-interest? And at least the case of Israel shows that it was not all about self-interest at all, unless we stretch the notion of interest beyond the practical. Same goes, by the way, you know, the reason why there is so much anger about Israel today is that there was so much disinterested morality involved in international decision-making to create the Jewish state. President Truman had no economic interest that I can think of in deciding to cast the US vote in favor of the Jewish state. Germany had many interests, but there was a moral dimension there too. And the rising voices that we discussed earlier from the grassroots had a moral tenor as well as economic or political interest. Same goes for the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is no longer about Israel, this is about Europe, about Germany and about Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a bottoms-up event. The consequent unification of Germany was obviously top-down as well, but it began as a bottoms-up event, which was about public morality in the deep sense, about culture, about sentiment. Now, I cannot believe, although I'm no specialist on East Asia, that there is no popular sentiment at work, sometimes dovetailing with economic interests, but at other times doing its own thing. And popular sentiment can become brutal and populist, but it can also be about a certain communal moral attitude, as is the case in South Korea, as is the case in Taiwan, as has been the case in certain attempts within Chinese society to raise up and to create some kind of an alternative statement from Tiananmen Square onwards and also before. There are countries in Southeast Asia we have not mentioned here, like Thailand and others. So, as a historian, I call upon you to revisit a broader range of motivations, some of which can be extremely effective motivations alongside the so-called realistic or self-interested explanations, which are important enough. But I think we need to recognize the moral dimension also as a game changer in the foreseeable future.
I'd like to mention, the moral dimension too to Hans. And first talk about the German-Israeli case and then come back to the Franco-German. Because if you look at German companies in Israel, when the going got really tough, like at the time of the Intifada, whichever one you want to choose, German companies stayed. And heads of German companies have written that they weren't motivated just by economic interest. There were other dimensions, and call them moral, whatever you want to call them. So I just like to mention that and I think that's the point Fania was making, that economic questions don't have to be just self-interest or just pragmatic. On the Franco-German case, I wanted to ask you where you date the economic interdependence from. Because if you mention the Schuman Plan, I don't know whether you start from the coal and steel community, but there were 5 years before that. And in the 5 years coming back again to civil society, there were many kinds of connections. There were major religious connections between Germany and France, starting in 1945, actually. Again, initiatives taken by the French. There were meetings of politicians mixed with religious dimensions. For example, the moral rearmaments venue in Ko, very important meetings took place there. Town twinning started. There was the Franco-German Institute in Ludwigsburg in 1948. You know, what I'm suggesting is that we're really talking about multiple layers, and some of it's sediment even. And so when you talk about economic interdependence, when do you start that? And maybe the economic interdependence was possible, and maybe Schuman was able to devise the Schuman Plan because these other things had already happened and there was some foundation so that there'd be a resonance, a public resonance. And I also wanted to ask you about the comparative question, because it seems to me Asians often look at the Franco-German case and look at the German-Polish case. They don't look at the German-Israeli or German-Czech. I think that's a mistake, actually, because on history issues, the latter two maybe tell us more. But the Franco-German case, is it useful for Japan and Korea because France was collaborationist? And that's an issue in Korea dealing with Japan?
Okay, thank you for this really fascinating panel. And I just had a couple of comments. One is stimulated by TJ's question about why did Ostpolitik work in the German case and why didn't the Sunshine Policy work in Korea? I don't know about the Sunshine Policy, but I want to come back to what Steph Haggard was saying about process versus endgame, because Ostpolitik did not really work in the sense that it did not bring about unification. Ostpolitik was a system for providing East Germany with lots and lots of West German cash, which East Germany used to pay off its debt to West Germany, and not for any kind of reform. And by the time 1989 came around, they were absolutely broke. There was no more money in any East German bank. And they didn't really have a choice. But that didn't even mean that there was going to be unification. It just meant that the GDR was going to collapse. Another factor is something that Lily had mentioned, these kind of external institutions. And there was one called the CSCE, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a treaty signed in 1974 that created a kind of civil society in East Germany and Eastern Europe in which this kind of protest could be nurtured. But that also wasn't part of Ostpolitik. So that the protest and the bankruptcy brought down the East German regime, but it didn't mean unification. Unification was about great power decisions. Even Kohl's plan for unification was very like, let's do it slow, let's think about how we're going to do it. And the Soviet Union was broke and said, okay, you know, you can absorb East Germany if you guys pay us, and they paid 50 billion euros, I think, about that, and that was a lot for that time. So I think it's really important to recognize they could have stopped at Ostpolitik, and we could have had nice reconciliation if all this other stuff hadn't happened. Now, I have a question for Professor Ying, the only Professor Ying in Taiwan. It strikes me that this rising inequality might also feeds into support for the DPP. As you mentioned, I mean, it looks to me like it's the 1% that's kind of, and the 10% that's really benefiting from these relationships with China. But I wonder if also, if this can be combined with an identity issue, if most, or is the increase in a kind of Taiwanese identity across party lines, or is it concentrated in the DPP in those who are losing out? It looks like losing out from the Taiwanese relationship with China.
Oh, you have direct answer? Because he has his hand up, but if you have your direct answer, sure, go ahead.
Just to Beverly's question, yeah? Because 1969, we have to remember the usury conflict. And this kind of a conflict has led to a great change of the international Großwetterlage. Usury, Peking, Moscow. Yeah? And Willy Brandt has tried to catch up the train of reconciliation. And that's why he succeed to diffuse the tension. So that's why he got the Nobel Prize for Peace by that time. But in Korea, by that time in the year 2000, it's not really changed anything here in our region, in the Northeast Asian region. So that's why I would say this is difficult to compare to the two cases, Kim Tae-jung and Willy Brandt. Yeah, okay, just to.
Thank you for your presentation. Yes, I'm Professor from South Korea. My question goes to Professor Yang. First of all, yes, I'm sorry, yes, I didn't listen to you because I have class, I'm somewhat read. But your title, social justice, is very, very complicated. Meaning, I mean, I do not know how do you define by the social justice such as the equality or equity, but unfortunately, as an economist, it is very, very difficult for us to define what is the social justice. Also, nowadays, the economists unanimously agree that globalization doesn't cause the social justice in the context of equality. I mean, there will be losers and winners from the globalization. This is the contradict of the Stopp-Samuelson theorem. Stopp-Samuelson theorem will keep us with the globalization, the gap between gain. Winners and losers will be smaller and smaller. But unfortunately, nowadays, the social justice in context of equality or disparity will be larger than before. Why? I'm not sure in Taiwan case, in Korean case, there is a big debate between this. Also, the next question goes to Professor Birgit. Also, actually, yes, I have been to North Korea in 1999 yes, in order for me to have the seminar with the North Korean professor. At that time, yes, we felt that there were a lot of ideological gap as well as the political concept like that. Most Koreans are expert about the Korean unification, but unfortunately, there is no unanimous way or strategy for us to expedite the unification. Even though yes, we can have several kinds of seminar in Korea, in China, or in Europe, but unfortunately there are no North Korean professor here. Right? So next time, yes, I suggested to invite the North Korean professor. That will be more or less persuading. Thank you.
I think in the interest of. I'm not sure this is on. Okay, well, in the interest of time, we could take one more question, and then I think we'll have a break until 5 o'clock.
It's working.
Oh, okay.
No, it's okay. Well, I wanted to ask a broader question, which is something that I've tried to grapple with myself, and I'm interested in what the panelists have to say, as well as the panelists from previously, which is the whole cultural applicability issue. My students, for instance, discover Ruth Benedict's Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and they always glob on to this guilt versus shame culture distinction. And I've thought about it a little bit. I don't know if I'm going to get stoned for bringing up Ruth Benedict. I don't know if that's passé as a political scientist, but it's always an argument that has resonated quite a bit. And so sometimes I wonder that when we talk about lessons from Europe, lessons from Germany for East Asia, we're dealing with two very different cultural environments. And so the guilt dynamics that have worked in Germany, because it's so embedded in the culture as well as in the culture of the neighbors, is not necessarily going to translate in the East Asian or the Northeast Asian context. If it's a shame culture or, because of Confucian values or what have you. So I'm interested actually in everybody's responses to that question about the applicability of guilt cultural dynamics in Northeast Asia.
Well, I think that was the last question. If people want to respond to that.
I would say the Japanese is very declined to criticize their ancestor. Yeah, for instance. It's also difficult for me to criticize my father, concerning what he has done. For instance, he's a criminal. He's a war criminal. But in Germany, it's totally different. Yeah, I would say this is a question of the religion, and religion has played a very important role, in the sense that all creatures are created by God. So before God, everybody's equal. But this kind of sense is that we don't have anything like that in Confucianism. In Confucianism, we have always the relative relationship. For instance, father and son, and the emperor and the descendant and the Untertan and so on. So it is always up and down. I mean, this is the relative relationship. This is we cannot find any in our ancient society any relationship that is equal, other than, for instance, classmates, or compatriots. If the phrases with the Chinese word 同学 or the 同乡, that means compatriots or the classmates, and they are equal. But still, we will distinguish among these people, either after age or after wisdom or after whatever. Yeah? So nobody is equal, actually, in the Confucian society. And that's why this is difficult for on the other hand, this is difficult for the Japanese to criticize, to make a critic on their ancestors, on their, and so on. And another thing I would say, the role of the United States is also very, very important by that time, just right after the Second World War, because the Americans, they occupied Germany, and also they occupied Japan. But for the Japanese, the Cold War started between U.S. side and Chinese side. So this is a totally different situation as U.S. and the German cooperation by that time. Yeah. Okay.
Hans, did you want to have the last word? Oh, you have the last word. Okay, this is the last word.
Oh, last word.
Last word.
I'd like to answer Bab's questions and also the professor from Korea together. Social justice, I agree. I didn't address that very clear, but allow me to share the information. if we have political campaign in Taiwan right now, and the social justice is probably the most often in the world, you will heard from the TV news. If we participate in any regional free trade agreement, or if we engage in any international discussions, so social justice always come out from the TV news. So if we build up the model, as Beverly just mentioned, we have 1%, 10% people holding more and more the GDP shares in Taiwan. So does that foster the Taiwanese identity or the pro-DPP? That might deserve research to answer that question. But let me take the shorter way to do that. If we add the income equality in the different prefectures, and also life expectancy in the different prefectures, and also how many beds for 1,000 people they can share in the different cities. And we added together, we took the lineage combinations and added this as we so-called social justice. And then we can design a model like a feedback rule, social justice, and the political polarizations, and which will foster political polarization by social justice, or political polarization will foster social justice issues. Then the angle will point to, so will this cause economic growth in Taiwan? So as TJ just mentioned, do we have the third drive or the other drive to explain this income equality? So after the suggestion from the panelists and also TJ and also Beverly and also audience, I think there's something deserve me to do after this presentation and the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll take a break until 5 o'clock.